Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. In this video, I'm going to provide a brief introduction to the free will problem. All right, so I think in order to understand why there might be a free will problem, we first need to know what free will means, what that phrase refers to. And probably you've used the phrase free will in your everyday discourse, so perhaps you might have said something like, "She deserves the punishment. She did it of her own free will," where you're suggesting something like her actions flowed from her decisions, or she did it intentionally, or she wasn't made to do it, she did it as a result of her choice. So, I think in our ordinary language, we say that a person acts freely when they're not forced to do something, or when they're not prevented from doing what they want to do. When you're not prevented from doing what you want to do, and when you're not made to do things, then the things that you end up doing result from your choices. So it seems like freedom requires that our actions result from our choices. And when an action does result from our choice, we say that we willed the action. We brought it about as a result of our decision. So taken together, we can say that we act freely when our actions aren't interfered with by others and when they result from our choices. So we're not made to do it, but the action also is not a mere accident. It's something we intended, and it's not done maybe by compulsion, but freely as the result of a choice. And the choice was the result of deliberation. So, more technically, philosophers are going to define freedom of will as the ability to do otherwise. On this account, I act freely if, when I do some action, I could have avoided doing it, just as a result of my decision. So, I just went to the grocery store, and I did it freely if I could have not gone to the grocery store just by choosing. So in that instance, I wouldn't have been made to go, and the reason I didn't go would be because I decided not to, and not because someone prevented me. This is what is meant by the ability to do otherwise. Anytime you do something, and you could have decided not to do it, and if your decision would have been effective, then you do it freely, because you could have done it, and you decided to do it, but you could have also not done it. Okay, why do we think that free will is important? Why have a debate about it? I think there's at least two reasons. I think, firstly, our actions seem to be very much tied up with our sense of personal identity. For example, a person feels pride regarding their successes and shame as the result of their mistakes. So we tend to think of our actions as reflections of our personhood or our identity. So we take pride in the things that we do well, the things that we work hard on. We feel maybe grateful that we make good choices, and then we feel shame or guilt when we make mistakes. And those emotions seem possible because we have a perception that we could have done otherwise. So shame seems a reaction to a decision that one regrets. But if one regrets the decision, then I think it's intuitive to think that you could have done otherwise when you made that decision. You were free to do it. So our sense of self seems bound up with the actions that we do. And that seems possible because it seems like we feel like those actions are attributable to our personhood. But if none of our actions are freely done, if we couldn't have avoided doing all of the things we've done in our life, that really reduces our sense of our personal identity. Likewise, I think freedom is crucially tied to the issue of moral responsibility. So we go through our lives holding people morally accountable for the things they do, and likewise, we hold ourselves accountable for the things we do. And when we hold people accountable for their wrongdoing, we seem to presuppose a choice on their behalf. We presuppose that they could have done otherwise. When someone freely chooses to do a bad action, we think that they endorsed doing the bad action. And that strikes us as particularly unethical. So freedom of will is crucially tied to this idea of moral responsibility. And moral responsibility is tied to the ability to do otherwise. So they're intrinsically linked, in other words. And we can see this by looking at what we have here called the principle of alternative possibilities. This principle is a principle of moral responsibility. It articulates when it's permissible to hold people accountable for what they do. And it says that we can only justifiably hold a person accountable for what they do if they could have done otherwise. If a person was made to do something, if they couldn't avoid doing it, then typically we think that they're off the hook morally. And I think we also view ourselves that way. Okay, so you should maybe be seeing how this relates to the question of free will. Because it says, essentially, we can only justifiably hold a person accountable if they have free will. Because look, supposing free will is the ability to do otherwise, then if we lack free will, it would follow that the principle of alternative possibilities could never be satisfied because no one could ever do otherwise. So there'll be no justified instances of holding a person morally accountable because in every case, what they did was unavoidable. So if this principle of alternative possibilities is right, then it's very important that we still have free will. And if we don't have free will, then our whole framework of moral responsibility needs to be revised. All right, next we should turn to the problem of free will. In other words, why might we lack it? What threatens it? What questions are there about the conceptual possibility of free will? Most generally, I think the free will problem arises when we reflect on some basic fundamental features of the universe and of persons. And that'll be the topic of the rest of this video. So there are two separate stories which illuminate the free will problem, and I'll tell both in this video. I think they ultimately say the same things, but make use of very different language. The first has to do with the nature of character and the way in which a person's character is formed. And then the second has to do with the nature of causation. And here by causation, I mean the idea that events have causes, that no events are uncaused, that nothing happens by miracle. So I'm going to tell a story about character and then a story about causation, each of which aims to illuminate why we might lack free will. So how was the character formed? In other words, where does it come from? Firstly, we need to know what a character is. A character is the bundle of personality traits possessed by a person which disposes or causes them to act in specific ways. So each person has a character, and that character is made up of these personality traits. So for example, we might say of a person that they're honest, impulsive, and courageous. Those are personality traits. Our personality traits cause us to act in the sense that they make us motivated to act in specific ways, in specific circumstances. And we can see this by reflecting on people with different personality traits faced with the same circumstances, likely doing different actions as a result of those different personality traits. So a person who's honest is likely to tell the truth. A person who's dishonest is likely to withhold the truth when faced with the exact same circumstances. So there we have two different personality traits disposing people or causing people to act differently. So a person who is honest, impulsive, and courageous is the one who tells the truth, acts without reflection, and faces their fears. That is to say that the bundle of character traits they possess causes them to behave in specific ways. So that's what a character is. But where do we get it? So how does a person become honest, impulsive, and courageous? And more generally, how does a person acquire the specific personality traits that influence their actions? So where does the character come from? And just as important, does a person have control over the processes which form their character? So we have two separate questions. First, what makes a person's character? What shapes it and forms it? And then two, does the person have control over that process? Because after all, if we have no control over the character we possess, if we don't control that process that makes the character we have, and if additionally, as I've been arguing, if our character is what causes us to act in one way rather than another, we may in turn lack full control over our actions. So the question will be, Where does our character come from? And do we have any control over that process? So I'm going to argue that our character comes from two important places. There's two different processes that shape our character. And they, of course, overlap and intervene on one another in various ways. The first will be environmental features. So our character seems to be shaped in a very complex way by our parents, their parenting style, our early social environment, the education we received, religion, culture, media, specific experiences like trauma in particular. These all come together to impact the kind of character we have in the sense that they provide for us or lead us to have specific personality traits. But what we should note here is that the adolescent has very little control over any of these features of their environment. Indeed, we seem to be really thrust into these specific circumstances. So this suggests that, especially when our brain is developing, we have very little control over the aspects of our environment that shape our brain in one way rather than another. Which means, from the perspective of environmental features, we don't have full control over how they shape our character or lead us to have specific personality traits. Next, I think just as important is genetics, biology. These seem to also play a role in shaping or forming our character. And I think what's noteworthy here is that genetics interact with the environmental features in complex ways to determine a person's character, their personality traits. So, for example, someone can inherit a genetic predisposition to addiction. And what might happen in their life is that they might experience a trauma, and that trauma may unlock that genetic predisposition to an addictive behavior. So that would be an example of our environment interacting with our genetics in order to produce certain kinds of personality traits or dispositions to act. And of course, even if we have maybe some impact over our social environment, especially as we become adults, it seems basically impossible to have any control over our genetics directly. Maybe hypothetically, other people can have control over our genetics, but it seems like we can't choose our genetics. And so, to the extent that our genetics impact the character we have, it would seem like the character we end up with is out of our control because we don't control this feature which leads to the character. So here we have the first problem statement. This expresses the relationship between character and free will. So a person's character disposes them to act in one way rather than another. That's just how character is being defined here. Premise 2, a person's character is shaped by environmental and biological features which are out of their control. That is what I've just argued. We don't select our parents or our early environment, and we don't select our biology. And these things shape our character. Since our character disposes us to act one way rather than another, and since the features of our environment and our biology are out of our control and shape our character, it seems to follow, premise 3, therefore, whether a person acts in one way rather than another is out of their control. Because they don't control the processes by which they get one kind of character rather than another. And their character plays a crucial role in the actions that they do. But since free will is the ability to do otherwise, it would seem that a person lacks free will, since after all, they don't have control over that which causes their actions. All right, so here the idea is, if we're going to be held accountable for our actions, if our actions are going to be genuinely free, then we need to have some control over that which causes them. But it's our character that causes them, and we don't have control over our character. Therefore, we don't have free will. Okay, that's problem statement number 1, and you might pause the video here and take a look at these arguments, the set of premises together with the conclusion, and think about whether this argument is successful, whether it really captures what we mean by character, what we mean by decisions, and what we mean by freedom. All right. Next, we have the thesis of determinism. This is going to be the second story about why there might be a problem with free will, why free will might be a conceptual impossibility. So determinism is the idea that every event has a cause. It's the idea that no events happen without being caused. Nothing happens by miracle. Everything that happens in the world happens as a result of things which precede it. And this applies to everything in the physical world. So determinism is just the general scientific idea that nothing happens randomly. Everything always has an explanation in terms of events which precede it. So determinism captures the idea that the physical universe is governed by physical causal laws. And physical causal laws are those laws which necessitate events. So an example of a physical causal law would be something like water freezes at 32 degrees. This is a law in the sense that it happens every single time. There's not a possible world where water doesn't freeze at 32 degrees. It'll never freeze at 40 degrees, and once it falls below 32, it will freeze. So it's necessitated by this causal law. According to determinism, the entire universe is governed by physical causal laws, such that everything that happens as the result of previous events together with the physical causal laws of the universe. Nothing is random. Everything happens as the result of things which precede it, and what determines what happens is the state of affairs together with the laws of nature. All right, so that gets us to our second problem statement. So on a specific conception of human beings, the thesis of determinism would apply to human action just as much as it applies to other events in the world. By a specific conception of human being, I mean the idea that human beings are physical. So, supposing the universe is all physical, and supposing human beings are just more physical stuff, it would seem that determinism would apply to human beings. Obviously, you might speculate that if we have a different conception of human beings, for example, that they're non-physical, then maybe this argument won't work, and that might be a route you might want to take in your arguments about this. So here is the argument. Premise 1, all events are caused. That's just the thesis of determinism. Premise 2 says that human actions are events. So this is just defining what human actions are. They're events in the world. You can conclude from 1 and 2 that human actions are caused. You should see how 3 just follows from 1 and 2. If all events are caused and human actions are events, then it must be the case that human actions are caused. But if human actions are caused, says the argument, then they aren't freely done. And since determinism is true, actions aren't freely done, and free will is false. So here I recommend again pausing and taking a look at this argument in detail. Maybe reflecting on each of the premises, and then thinking about whether the premises come together in order to show that the conclusion is true. Maybe you can think about what problems you see with this argument. All right, so philosophers like to talk about the free will problem as being about a compatibility question. The question of whether we possess free will is a question of whether free will and determinism are compatible, which is to say, it's a question of whether they can both be true. So to use different language, it's a question about whether free will and determinism are mutually exclusive. Anytime two things are mutually exclusive, they both can't be true at the same time. So if free will and determinism are mutually exclusive, they both can't be true. One can be true or the other can be true, perhaps neither can be true, but they both can't be true at the same time. So the question is, are free will and determinism mutually exclusive, or are they compatible? After all, both free will and determinism do seem intuitive and plausible. So with determinism, it seems intuitive because it's hard to imagine events occurring without a cause. It's hard to imagine things happening randomly. We don't have any evidence of that. So determinism seems to accurately describe the world we live in. It seems to accurately describe the universe. And so it seems like determinism is true. In other words, it's hard to falsify determinism. And on the other hand, at the same time, free will seems intuitive because our choices feel real. We experience our decision-making process. So we experience evaluating the evidence, reflecting on the evidence, weighing our choices, arriving at a decision, and then our decision becoming an action in the world. And then we feel emotions about the action we did, like shame and pride, as a result of what we do. This whole process feels subjectively real to us. We all have this experience. So it does feel like we're free. So free will also seems intuitive. And so what I want you to see here is that we have two intuitive notions. Determinism seems intuitive and true because it seems like every event has a cause. And free will seems intuitive and true because we experience ourselves as free. So how can these concepts both be true at the same time? And do they conflict with one another? All right, so regarding the compatibility question, there are a number of answers given. So the question is, are free will and determinism compatible, or are they mutually exclusive? All right, the first position is called incompatibilism. And incompatibilism is the view that free will and determinism are incompatible, which is to say mutually exclusive. They both can't be true at the same time. And there are two subset positions within incompatibilism. The first is called hard determinism. Hard determinism is a version of incompatibilism, so it says that free will and determinism are incompatible. But it says, look, determinism can't be false. Every event definitely has a cause. So determinism is true. And then furthermore, hard determinists will say, given the nature of determinism, we lack free will. Free will is false. So hard determinists view free will and determinism as incompatible, as mutually exclusive. Now the challenge for hard determinists will be to articulate what we ought to do about moral responsibility. For after all, they're denying freedom of the will. They're denying the ability to do otherwise. And as we saw, it seems like it's only permissible or justifiable to hold people morally accountable for what they do if they could have done otherwise. So hard determinism argues that the conditions for the principle of alternative possibilities never obtain. All right, next we have libertarianism, and libertarianism says the opposite of hard determinism. It says that free will and determinism are incompatible, but that determinism is false. So we possess free will. So the libertarians going to argue that determinism is false about human action. They're not saying that no events have a cause. They're saying that the thesis of determinism doesn't apply to human action in the way that maybe it applies to other things. And there's a number of ways in which libertarians make their argument. I'll just articulate one of them. They might say something like the following. It's true that all events are caused in the physical universe. So everything that's physical is going to be constrained by the causal laws of nature and the thesis of determinism. But, says the libertarian, of at least one stripe, human beings are not all physical. Human beings have some non-physical aspects. And these are crucial non-physical aspects. This is the mind, or maybe the soul. So determinism says that all events are caused, but it's speaking about the physical things of the universe. But the mind is non-physical, and the mind is where the decision-making happens. And so the thesis of determinism doesn't apply to the mind, and so therefore we retain free will. Or alternatively, you might make an argument of a similar color by pointing out that we have a soul, and maybe saying that decision-making resides in the soul. All right, that's libertarianism. And then finally, we have compatibilism. Compatibilism is the view that free will and determinism are compatible, and therefore we possess free will, even if determinism is true. So compatibilists argue that free will and determinism are not actually mutually exclusive, that they don't threaten one another. And there's many ways that compatibilists make this argument. One will be fairly clever. It'll say something like the following. Determinism says that all events are caused, and it additionally says that human actions are events. Thus, it follows that human actions are caused. But the compatibilist will say, but human actions are caused by human decisions. So under the right circumstances, our actions are caused by our decision-making process. And that's all we really want for free will. We want our decisions to cause our actions. It might be that our decisions are caused by other things, like our character, but all we really want for freedom of the will is for our actions to follow from our decisions. As long as our actions follow from our decisions, then we're free. If, on the other hand, we decide to go to the grocery store and then someone locks us up in our house such that we can't go to the grocery store, then we aren't free. because then our decisions aren't causing our actions. So compatibilism is going to rely on the idea that actually free will and determinism don't conflict with one another. Compatibilists might also argue that, in fact, determinism is necessary for free will. And they'll make something like the following argument. Determinism says that every event has a cause. And it seems like human actions are events, therefore human actions are caused. The compatibilists will say, well, that's just what we want. Because if our actions aren't caused, then they're random. And when we say we do something freely, we don't mean to say that it happened randomly or that we randomly did it. We want to say that we decided to do it, we thought about it, and then did it. And it's our thinking about it, deliberating about it, that causes our action. And that's actually what gets us free will. So the compatibilists might argue that there's actually a mutually supportive relationship between free will and determinism.